Have you ever felt it? That subtle, creeping shadow in your mind, the kind that doesn't demand attention but refuses to let you go. It starts so small, almost unnoticeable. A restless night, a skipped meal, a moment of hesitation that lingers a little too long. You brush it off, thinking it's nothing. Just stress. Just life. But then it grows. Before you know it, you're avoiding calls from friends, dreading simple errands, questioning every decision you make. It's as if an invisible force has taken over, steering your life in directions you never intended to go. You tell yourself it's fine. You're fine. But deep down, you know something isn't right. These are often the signs of anxiety taking over your life, and they're more common than you think. This is where Sarah's story begins. Her life wasn't supposed to feel this way. On the outside, she had it all: a thriving career, supportive friends, a bright future ahead. But beneath the surface, anxiety was slowly taking control, piece by piece. She didn't know it then, but her journey would take her to the edge of fear and back, transforming not just her mind but her entire way of living. If you've ever searched for real-life anxiety success stories or wondered how to overcome anxiety naturally, Sarah's journey is one you'll want to hear. It's a story of resilience and rediscovery, one that shows anxiety isn't just something to endure, it's something you can confront and transform. What happened to Sarah could happen to anyone. It could happen to you. But what if the darkness we dread isn't here to destroy us? What if it's here to teach us something we never knew we needed? This is the story of Sarah, her battle with anxiety, and how she found her way back, not to the life she once had, but to the life she was always meant to live. For Sarah, anxiety didn't burst into her life like a sudden storm. It crept in quietly, like a subtle shadow at the edge of her mind, unnoticed at first but persistent. Initially, it was easy to ignore. A racing heartbeat after a long day at work? Just tired, she thought. A sleepless night spent replaying conversations? That's normal, right? But anxiety has a way of expanding, turning moments of discomfort into a suffocating presence that takes over your world. Sarah was the kind of person everyone admired. From the outside, her life in Seattle seemed ideal: an accomplished marketing professional with a close-knit group of friends and a promising future. She had an apartment in a vibrant neighborhood, an enviable wardrobe, and the reputation of someone who always had it together. But beneath the polished surface, her inner world was unraveling. The first cracks appeared in small, almost invisible ways. She began canceling plans. "I'm swamped at work," she'd tell her friends, but the truth was simpler. The thought of socializing felt unbearable. Even answering texts became a chore. Then came the skipped meals, the missed gym sessions, the weekends spent binge-watching TV not because she wanted to but because the outside world felt overwhelming. At work, her focus began to slip. Meetings that once energized her now drained every ounce of her mental strength. Even sending a simple email became a struggle, her mind obsessively scanning for mistakes. What if they think I'm unprofessional? What if I sound stupid? Her confidence, once a defining trait, felt like a distant memory. For months, Sarah brushed these feelings aside, labeling them as stress or burnout. After all, everyone in her field dealt with long hours and high pressure. But the more she ignored her symptoms, the more they intensified. Anxiety wasn't just visiting, it was setting up camp in her life. The breaking point came on a Tuesday. It was a routine day at the office, and Sarah was scheduled to give a team presentation. Public speaking had never been her favorite activity, but she'd always managed. She spent the night before rehearsing her slides, fine-tuning every detail until she felt prepared. But when the moment arrived, her body betrayed her. As she walked to the front of the room, she felt a wave of dizziness. Her palms were damp, her heart pounded against her chest, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Her vision blurred. Standing at the podium, she opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Panic flooded her senses, loud and unrelenting. All she could think was, "They're all watching me. They know I can't handle this. What if I faint?" Somehow, she stumbled through the presentation, her voice trembling and her thoughts spiraling. When it was over, she bolted to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall as tears streamed down her face. She felt humiliated, broken. For the first time, she couldn't deny the truth. This isn't just stress. Something is really wrong. Sitting alone in her office later that afternoon, Sarah replayed the morning in her head, feeling the weight of her anxiety like a crushing force. Her thoughts circled endlessly. How did I let it get this bad? She stared at the clock on the wall, watching the seconds tick by, and felt a strange mix of despair and determination. I can't keep living like this. Something has to change. That realization marked the beginning of Sarah's journey, a decision to stop running from her anxiety and start confronting it. It wasn't an easy decision. Anxiety, for all its pain, had become familiar, even comforting in a twisted way. But as terrifying as change felt, staying the same was no longer an option. That night, she Googled help for anxiety and clicked on a link to a local therapist's office. Filling out the online appointment request felt monumental, like a small but significant step toward reclaiming her life. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know it yet, but the road ahead would change everything, not just how she managed her anxiety, but how she saw herself and the world around her. Sarah sat in her car, parked outside the beige brick building that housed the therapist's office. Her hands gripped the steering wheel as she stared at the entrance. It felt like an impossible hurdle, one she wasn't sure she had the strength to cross. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her mind swirling with doubts. What if this doesn't work? What if the therapist thinks I'm crazy? What if nothing ever changes? For a moment, she considered driving away, convincing herself that she could handle her anxiety on her own. But then the memory of that awful morning in the conference room flashed through her mind, the racing heart, the shaky hands, the humiliation. That moment had shown her that she couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. She took a deep breath, grabbed her bag, and stepped out of the car. Inside, the waiting room was quiet, the walls painted a soft, calming blue. Sarah sat down on one of the chairs, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of her phone case. When the door opened, a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile stepped into the room. "Sarah," the woman said. That was Dr. Peterson. And that was the moment Sarah's life began to shift. Sarah didn't know what to expect from therapy. She'd heard mixed things over the years. Some people swore it was life-changing, while others dismissed it as little more than talking about your feelings. Still, she was here, and that was enough for now. Dr. Peterson began the session with a simple question. What brings you here today? The question seemed almost laughable to Sarah. Where could she even start? With the sleepless nights? The racing thoughts? The panic attack that had left her feeling like a shell of herself? So, she started with the truth. "I feel like I'm falling apart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Peterson nodded, her expression soft and understanding. "That's a hard place to be," she said. "But you don't have to stay there." As Sarah talked, haltingly at first but with growing openness, Dr. Peterson listened intently. For the first time, Sarah felt like someone wasn't judging her or trying to fix her. They were just there to understand. And that alone was a kind of relief Sarah hadn't realized she needed. By the end of the session, Dr. Peterson introduced Sarah to a concept she had never considered. Her anxiety wasn't a personal failing or a weakness. It was her brain's way of responding to stress, a learned pattern that could be unlearned. "You've been living in survival mode for so long," Dr. Peterson explained, "that your brain thinks it needs to be on high alert all the time. But we can work on that together." Sarah left that first session feeling a mix of emotions, relief, curiosity, and an overwhelming sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The real work began in the weeks that followed. Dr. Peterson introduced Sarah to cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, a method designed to help people identify and reframe negative thought patterns. At first, Sarah was skeptical. Writing down her anxious thoughts and analyzing them felt strange, even pointless. But she trusted Dr. Peterson and decided to give it a try. One of their first exercises involved a recent example of Sarah's anxiety. She had been worried about a project deadline, convinced she would fail and let her team down. Dr. Peterson asked her to write down that thought, "I'm going to mess this up, and everyone will think I'm incompetent." Then, she had to challenge it. "What evidence do you have that this is true?" Dr. Peterson asked. "And what evidence do you have that it isn't?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She realized she didn't have much evidence to support her fear. Her team had always praised her work. She'd met deadlines countless times before. The thought wasn't based on facts, it was based on fear. Over time, Sarah began to notice how often her mind jumped to worst-case scenarios. But instead of spiraling, she started to pause and question those thoughts. Was it really true? What was the worst that could actually happen? Could she handle it if it did? Dr. Peterson also introduced Sarah to mindfulness meditation, a practice that felt almost foreign to her fast-paced, overthinking brain. "You want me to sit still and focus on my breathing?" Sarah had joked during one session. But as reluctant as she was, she gave it a try. At first, it was uncomfortable. Her mind wandered constantly, jumping from one worry to the next. But Dr. Peterson assured her that this was normal. "The goal isn't to stop your thoughts," she said. "It's to notice them without judgment and let them pass." Gradually, Sarah began to feel the benefits. In the quiet moments of her day, while brushing her teeth or waiting for her coffee to brew, she'd take a few deep breaths and center herself. These small pauses didn't erase her anxiety, but they gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. By the end of her first month in therapy, Sarah was starting to see small but significant changes. She still had anxious thoughts, but they didn't dominate her like they used to. She still felt fear, but she was learning how to face it instead of running from it. The work was far from over, but Sarah was finally on a path forward. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was starting to live again. Therapy didn't transform Sarah overnight. The changes were subtle at first, almost unnoticeable, like the slow shift of seasons. But piece by piece, she began to rebuild her life, starting with the way she thought about herself and her anxiety. Dr. Peterson had planted a simple but powerful seed: your thoughts aren't always facts. And with that, Sarah started to challenge the narratives her anxiety had been feeding her for years. It began with a notebook, an ordinary spiral-bound journal where Sarah recorded her anxious thoughts. At first, the exercise felt awkward. Writing down her fears made them seem even more real, and challenging them felt like trying to convince herself of something she didn't quite believe. But she stuck with it. One day, she wrote, "I'll embarrass myself at the next team meeting. Everyone will think I'm terrible at my job." Underneath, she followed the process Dr. Peterson had taught her, breaking the thought down into smaller pieces. "What's the evidence for this?" she asked herself. "What's the evidence against it?" The evidence against her fears surprised her. Her past presentations had gone well. Her boss had complimented her preparation just last week. And even if she stumbled, Sarah realized, it wouldn't erase the years of hard work and success she'd built in her career. Slowly, these exercises began to chip away at the power her anxiety held over her. The changes weren't limited to her thoughts. Sarah also began exploring mindfulness meditation, a practice Dr. Peterson described as training the mind to be present. At first, Sarah found it frustrating. Sitting still and focusing on her breath felt counterproductive when her mind was racing with to-do lists and worries about the future. But one morning, while waiting in line for her coffee, she decided to give it a try. She closed her eyes briefly, took a deep breath, and focused on the feeling of her feet on the ground, the warmth of the coffee shop, the soft murmur of voices around her. For the first time in weeks, her thoughts stopped spiraling, if only for a moment. From then on, she began to incorporate mindfulness into her daily life, not as a cure-all, but as a tool. Before meetings, she'd take a few deep breaths to ground herself. During her commute, she'd notice the changing leaves on the trees or the hum of the city streets. These small pauses didn't erase her anxiety, but they gave her a sense of control she hadn't felt in years. The most significant shifts came when Sarah began confronting her fears directly. One of the biggest challenges anxiety had imposed on her was social avoidance. She had spent months dodging invitations to happy hours and birthday parties, afraid of awkward silences or judgment from others. The idea of putting herself out there felt terrifying, but she knew she couldn't keep hiding. Dr. Peterson suggested starting small. "Pick something manageable," she said. "Something that feels challenging but not impossible." Sarah's first step was agreeing to have coffee with Jenna, her best friend. She was nervous, but as they sat in a cozy corner of their favorite cafe, chatting about work and life, Sarah felt a sense of normalcy she hadn't experienced in a long time. Jenna's laughter, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the warmth of the sun streaming through the window, it all felt grounding, even comforting. Encouraged by this small success, Sarah began to take more risks. She attended a co-worker's birthday dinner, something she would have avoided like the plague just weeks earlier. The first hour was tough, her mind raced with self-doubt. But as the evening went on, she found herself laughing at a joke, sharing a story, and even enjoying the moment. When she left, she felt proud, not because the night had been perfect, but because she had shown up. Each step forward, no matter how small, felt like a victory. Sarah began to realize that her anxiety had been lying to her all along, convincing her that the worst-case scenario was inevitable. But with every coffee date, every meeting, every small act of courage, she proved her fears wrong. Perhaps the most profound shift came in how Sarah saw herself. For years, she had equated her worth with her productivity, her ability to perform perfectly, and her image in the eyes of others. Therapy helped her see that she didn't need to be flawless to be valuable. She was allowed to make mistakes, to have bad days, to be human. One day, Sarah had a meeting with her boss to discuss a big project. Normally, she would have spent hours rehearsing every detail, terrified of saying the wrong thing. But this time, she prepared thoroughly, took a deep breath, and walked in with confidence. When her boss complimented her ideas, she didn't brush it off or dismiss it as luck. She allowed herself to feel proud. Sarah's small shifts added up to something big. Her world, which had felt so small and suffocating, was expanding again. She was reconnecting with friends, rediscovering old hobbies, and even trying new things. Anxiety was still a part of her life, but it no longer controlled her. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was living, not perfectly, not fearlessly, but fully. Sarah's journey wasn't smooth, but it was marked by moments of quiet triumph that slowly reshaped her life. Her therapy sessions with Dr. Peterson continued to focus on identifying her triggers and challenging her anxious thoughts. But the real breakthroughs happened when Sarah stepped out of the safety of therapy and into the real world, testing everything she'd been learning. The first major challenge came in the form of a networking event, something Sarah would have previously avoided at all costs. Just the thought of entering a room full of strangers made her palms sweat and her chest tighten. But Dr. Peterson had gently encouraged her to face her fear. "You don't have to stay the whole time," she said. "Even showing up for 10 minutes is a win." On the day of the event, Sarah almost backed out. Standing in front of her closet, she stared at her options, second-guessing everything. "What if I say something dumb? What if no one talks to me?" But she remembered what she'd learned in therapy. Her anxious thoughts weren't facts. She didn't need to listen to them. She chose a simple outfit, took a deep breath, and told herself, just 10 minutes. Walking into the venue felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The room buzzed with chatter, and the sight of confident strangers laughing and mingling made her heart race. For a moment, she froze, considering an escape route. But then a friendly woman at the check-in table smiled at her and asked about her work. That small act of kindness grounded her. "I'm in marketing," Sarah replied, surprised at how steady her voice sounded. She introduced herself to a few people, laughed at a joke, and even exchanged business cards with someone in her field. Those 10 minutes stretched into 20, then 30. When she finally left, she felt a wave of relief, but also pride. She hadn't been perfect, but she had shown up. And that, she realized, was enough. The next breakthrough came in her personal life. For months, Sarah had been avoiding social gatherings with her closest friends, convincing herself that they didn't really miss her. But deep down, she felt isolated and lonely. When Jenna invited her to a small dinner party, Sarah hesitated. "What if I feel awkward? What if I say the wrong thing?" But this time, she didn't let her fears decide for her. She went. The evening started off rocky. She felt the familiar tension in her chest as she walked into Jenna's cozy apartment. The smell of home-cooked pasta filled the air, and the sound of laughter made her feel both comforted and out of place. For the first hour, she mostly listened, smiling politely and nodding at jokes. But then, something shifted. Jenna asked her about a recent project at work, and as Sarah began to talk, she noticed that the tension in her chest started to ease. Her friends were genuinely interested. No one was judging her. The warmth of the room, the shared laughter, the simple joy of being present, it reminded Sarah of something she'd forgotten. She was allowed to take up space. By the end of the night, Sarah felt lighter, more connected. Her anxiety didn't vanish, but it no longer dictated her every move. One of Sarah's most significant breakthroughs came at work, the place where her anxiety had first come to a head. A few months after her therapy journey began, she was asked to lead a high-stakes presentation for a major client. In the past, the mere idea of this would have sent her spiraling into sleepless nights and obsessive preparation. But now, armed with the tools she'd learned, she approached it differently. She prepared thoroughly but didn't aim for perfection. On the morning of the presentation, she spent 5 minutes practicing mindfulness, focusing on her breath and calming her racing thoughts. She reminded herself, it doesn't have to be flawless, it just has to be real. Standing in front of the room, Sarah felt her heart flutter, but she didn't panic. She took a deep breath, smiled at the audience, and began. Her voice wavered slightly at first, but as she moved through her slides, she found her rhythm. She even ad-libbed a joke that drew laughter from the crowd, a moment that might have terrified her months earlier but now felt natural. When it was over, the client applauded, and her manager gave her a thumbs up. But the real victory wasn't in the external validation, it was in how she felt. She wasn't crushed by fear or consumed by self-doubt. She had faced her anxiety and come out stronger. Sarah's breakthroughs weren't about eliminating anxiety, they were about reclaiming her life. She realized that anxiety might always be a part of her, but it didn't have to control her. Each small step, attending a dinner party, speaking up in a meeting, saying yes to a new experience, helped her rebuild the confidence she thought she'd lost. More importantly, Sarah discovered that she didn't have to be perfect to be worthy of joy, connection, and success. Her journey wasn't just about overcoming anxiety, it was about embracing her humanity, flaws and all. For Sarah, the real breakthrough wasn't in becoming fearless, it was in learning that she didn't have to let fear define her. For Sarah, mindfulness became more than just a tool, it became her anchor. At first, the idea of mindfulness seemed abstract, even cliché. Just focus on your breathing, Dr. Peterson had told her. But Sarah couldn't understand how such a simple act could possibly make a difference. After all, how could breathing help when her mind felt like it was in a tornado of chaos? But over time, mindfulness began to work its quiet magic. Sarah's introduction to mindfulness started small. Dr. Peterson asked her to spend 5 minutes a day sitting quietly, focusing on her breath. The first few attempts were a disaster. Sarah's thoughts would bounce from one worry to the next. Did I forget to reply to that email? What if I mess up tomorrow's meeting? Am I wasting time just sitting here? She felt restless, her mind refusing to cooperate. But Dr. Peterson encouraged her to keep going. The goal isn't to stop your thoughts, she explained. It's to notice them without judgment and let them pass, like clouds in the sky. The metaphor stuck with Sarah. The next time she sat down to practice, she imagined her anxious thoughts as fluffy white clouds drifting across a blue sky. Some were big and ominous, others small and fleeting. Instead of trying to push them away, she observed them, letting them come and go. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As Sarah practiced mindfulness, she began to notice subtle changes. During her morning coffee, instead of scrolling through emails, she would pause to savor the warmth of the mug in her hands, the rich aroma, the first sip of liquid comfort. These moments, though brief, gave her a sense of calm she hadn't felt in years. At work, she started using mindfulness before stressful meetings. While waiting in the conference room, she'd take a few deep breaths, grounding herself in the present moment. She focused on the feeling of her feet on the floor, the sound of her breath, the rise and fall of her chest. These small rituals helped her approach situations with a clearer mind and steadier nerves. One day, while walking through Pike Place Market on her lunch break, Sarah realized she wasn't lost in her usual spiral of worries. Instead, she was fully present, taking in the sights and sounds around her, the vibrant colors of the flower stands, the laughter of tourists, the salty tang of the ocean breeze. For the first time in a long time, she felt connected to the world around her. Mindfulness also changed the way Sarah related to her emotions. Before, she'd been caught in a cycle of fear and frustration, constantly berating herself for feeling anxious. Why can't I just get over this? Why am I so weak? But mindfulness taught her a different approach, self-compassion. When anxiety showed up, instead of fighting it or criticizing herself, she started to respond with kindness. It's okay to feel this way, she would tell herself. This is hard, but I can handle it. By treating herself with the same empathy she would offer a friend, Sarah found that the intensity of her anxiety began to soften. She also learned that her emotions, no matter how overwhelming, were temporary. During a particularly stressful day at work, Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. But instead of panicking, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This feeling will pass, she reminded herself. And it did. One of the most powerful moments in Sarah's mindfulness journey came during a family gathering. For years, these events had been a source of stress, too many people, too much noise, too many unspoken expectations. But this time, Sarah approached it differently. Before walking in, she paused outside the front door, taking a moment to ground herself. She focused on her breath, calming her racing heart. As the evening unfolded, she practiced staying present. Instead of worrying about saying the right thing or analyzing every interaction, she simply listened, engaged, and let herself be in the moment. At the end of the night, her sister pulled her aside. "You seemed so calm tonight," she said. "It was nice to see you like that." Sarah smiled. It wasn't that the evening had been without its challenges, but for the first time, she hadn't let anxiety control her. She had been there fully, completely, unapologetically there. As mindfulness became a regular part of Sarah's life, it started to transform her relationships. She found herself more patient with her coworkers, more present with her friends, and more compassionate with herself. The frantic, scattered energy that had once defined her interactions was replaced with a quiet confidence. Through mindfulness, Sarah discovered that being present wasn't just about reducing anxiety, it was about enhancing every aspect of her life. She learned to appreciate the small, beautiful moments she'd once overlooked, the sound of rain against her window, the joy of laughter shared with friends, the simple pleasure of a deep breath. Mindfulness didn't erase Sarah's anxiety, but it changed her relationship with it. Instead of being consumed by her fears, she learned to observe them, accept them, and let them go. Anxiety no longer felt like an enemy to be defeated, it was simply a part of her experience, one that she could navigate with grace. By staying present, Sarah found freedom not from her anxiety, but within herself. And that, she realized, was the greatest gift of all. Sarah had always been the type of person who prided herself on independence. Asking for help wasn't in her nature. She believed that sharing her struggles would burden others, or worse, make her appear weak. But as she began her journey of confronting anxiety, she realized that carrying the weight alone was no longer sustainable. The first step in seeking support came when she opened up to her best friend, Jenna. For weeks, Sarah had dodged Jenna's calls and texts, too consumed by her own fears to face even the closest people in her life. But one night, after a particularly tough day, Sarah found herself dialing Jenna's number. "Hey, stranger." Jenna's voice was bright and warm, but it quickly shifted to concern when she heard the hesitation in Sarah's. "Are you okay?" Sarah hesitated, but then the words came tumbling out. She talked about the sleepless nights, the racing thoughts, the panic attack in the conference room. By the time she finished, her voice was trembling. "I feel like I'm losing control," she admitted, her throat tight. To her surprise, Jenna didn't react with judgment or pity. Instead, she said, "Sarah, I had no idea you were feeling this way. I'm so glad you told me." The conversation that followed was full of understanding and reassurance. Jenna shared her own struggles with stress and anxiety, making Sarah feel less alone. It was the first time Sarah realized that vulnerability didn't have to equal weakness. It could be a bridge to connection. Encouraged by that experience, Sarah began to expand her circle of support. She joined a local anxiety support group that Dr. Peterson had recommended. At first, the idea of sitting in a room full of strangers and talking about her feelings felt terrifying. What if she didn't fit in? What if her struggles weren't bad enough compared to others? But when she walked into the small community center where the group met, she was greeted with a warmth that immediately put her at ease. People introduced themselves, shared their stories, and listened without interruption or judgment. As Sarah listened, she realized how much she resonated with the experiences of others. The way their voices quivered when describing panic attacks, the guilt they felt for not being strong enough, the relief they expressed at simply being heard. When it was her turn to speak, Sarah felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach, but she pushed through. "I didn't realize how much I needed this," she said at the end of her story, her voice steady for the first time that night. And she meant it. The support group became a lifeline for Sarah. Hearing others share their progress and setbacks reminded her that healing wasn't linear, and that was okay. On particularly tough days, knowing she wasn't alone gave her the strength to keep going. And as she became more comfortable in the group, she found herself offering encouragement to others, something she never thought she'd be able to do while still battling her own anxiety. One of the most transformative lessons Sarah learned was the importance of seeking help without shame. Growing up, she'd internalized the idea that asking for help meant you were failing. But as she connected with her therapist, her friends, and her support group, she saw that reaching out was one of the bravest things she could do. Dr. Peterson reinforced this during one of their sessions. "Strength isn't about doing everything on your own," she said. "It's about knowing when to lean on others." Sarah began to see her relationships in a new light. Instead of worrying about being a burden, she focused on the mutual give and take that healthy connections provide. She started opening up to her coworkers, sharing small glimpses of her struggles when it felt appropriate. To her surprise, many of them responded with empathy, even sharing their own experiences with stress and mental health. These conversations didn't just strengthen her relationships, they also reduced the stigma she had built around her own anxiety. Talking about it openly made it feel less like a shameful secret and more like a part of her story. Perhaps the most profound realization Sarah had was that support could come in many forms. While her therapist provided tools and guidance, her friends offered understanding, and her support group gave her a sense of community. Each played a vital role in her journey. But there was one type of support that Sarah hadn't anticipated, the one she would give herself. As she continued her mindfulness practice and therapy, Sarah began to cultivate self-compassion. On days when her anxiety flared up, she learned to treat herself with kindness instead of frustration. "You're doing the best you can," she would remind herself. And in those moments, she realized that being her own ally was just as important as leaning on others. Reaching out for help didn't solve all of Sarah's problems, but it gave her the strength to face them. It reminded her that she wasn't alone, that even in her darkest moments, there were people willing to stand by her side. And slowly but surely, those connections became a source of light, guiding her toward a life that felt less heavy, less lonely, and more hopeful. As Sarah continued her journey, the small, steady steps she had taken began to add up. Therapy sessions, mindfulness practices, and leaning on her support system had started to transform her relationship with anxiety. It was no longer the all-consuming force that dictated every aspect of her life. Instead, it became something she could acknowledge, manage, and, on her best days, even ignore. But the most profound transformation wasn't just about less anxiety, it was about reclaiming her life. One of the first signs of change came during a work presentation. A few months earlier, this would have been a source of paralyzing dread. Sarah would have spent sleepless nights obsessing over every detail, imagining the worst-case scenarios that might unfold. But now, she approached the challenge differently. On the morning of the presentation, she set aside time for mindfulness meditation. She closed her eyes, took slow, deliberate breaths, and reminded herself of a simple truth: I am prepared. I am capable. I don't need to be perfect to succeed. The knot in her stomach didn't disappear entirely, but it loosened enough for her to walk into the conference room with confidence. As she spoke, she felt a small flutter of nerves but didn't let it overwhelm her. Her voice wavered slightly at first but grew steadier with each slide. She even ad-libbed a light-hearted comment that drew genuine laughter from her colleagues. When she finished, the applause felt like more than just validation. It was a symbol of how far she'd come. This wasn't a moment defined by perfection but by authenticity. And for Sarah, that was a victory. The transformation didn't stop at work. In her personal life, Sarah began to reconnect with the things that once brought her joy. Anxiety had stolen so much from her: her love of hiking, her interest in photography, even her curiosity about trying new things. Slowly, she started to reclaim those parts of herself. One crisp Saturday morning, she laced up her hiking boots and drove to a nearby trail she hadn't visited in years. As she climbed the winding path, surrounded by towering evergreens and the scent of fresh pine, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She paused at the summit, taking in the sweeping views of the mountains, and smiled. For the first time, she wasn't thinking about deadlines or worries. She was simply present. Another breakthrough came when she picked up her old camera, dusting it off and taking it with her on walks around the city. Photography had once been her way of capturing beauty in the world, but anxiety had drained her of that perspective. Now, as she framed shots of blooming flowers in the park or the golden glow of sunset over the Seattle skyline, she felt her creativity spark again. These small moments of rediscovery reminded her of who she was beyond her anxiety. Perhaps the most unexpected transformation was in Sarah's relationships. Before, anxiety had made her withdraw from the people she cared about. She avoided gatherings, canceled plans, and kept her struggles hidden out of fear of judgment. But as she opened up, first to Jenna, then to her support group, and eventually to others, she realized how much she had underestimated the power of connection. At a friend's birthday dinner, Sarah found herself laughing at stories, sharing her own updates, and feeling fully engaged in the moment. The anxiety that had once convinced her she didn't belong was still there, but its voice was quieter now, easier to ignore. She didn't have to be the life of the party or say the perfect thing, she just had to show up as herself. This newfound confidence even extended to meeting new people. Sarah began volunteering at a local community center, helping organize events for families in need. The work was meaningful, and it gave her a chance to connect with others in a way that felt authentic and fulfilling. Each time she stepped out of her comfort zone, her world expanded a little more. The culmination of Sarah's transformation came during a particularly stressful week at work. Multiple deadlines loomed, her schedule was packed, and unexpected challenges kept cropping up. In the past, this kind of pressure would have sent her spiraling. But now, she approached it differently. Instead of letting her thoughts race, she took things one step at a time. She prioritized her tasks, communicated her needs to her team, and gave herself permission to take breaks when she needed them. On Friday afternoon, as she wrapped up her final project, she felt tired but proud. She had faced a week that once would have overwhelmed her and come out on the other side stronger. Sarah's transformation wasn't about erasing anxiety, it was about learning to live alongside it. She realized that life wasn't about avoiding discomfort but about building the tools and resilience to handle it. Anxiety was no longer the enemy, it was a part of her story, one that had taught her strength, self-compassion, and the value of connection. As she reflected on her journey, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for the anxiety itself but for what it had taught her. It had pushed her to seek help, to confront her fears, and to rediscover the parts of herself she thought she'd lost. It had shown her that she was stronger than she ever realized. For Sarah, the transformation wasn't just about surviving anxiety. It was about reclaiming joy, embracing imperfection, and living a life that felt true to herself. Anxiety might always be there, but it no longer defined her. She was free not from fear, but from letting fear control her. And that, she realized, was the greatest victory of all.